You're listening to Always Player One, a solo board gaming podcast.
Hello and welcome to Always Player One. I'm Scruffy Gamer.
And I'm Norm. Okay, so today, guys, we're going to be talking about the classic splotter game, Roads and Boats. We're also going to be opening up the discussion to talk about other interactive games that are then played solo and how that translates.
Yep, but before we get started today, it's pretty exciting news. We are launching our Patreon. Links are available in the description. And the reason we're doing this is because we really want people signed up to join us on Discord, where we'll be able to talk to you directly, get your feedback directly firsthand. And if you're interested, there are options on the Patreon to be able to take part in our online polls and have your say in what we cover in the episodes and what tournaments we run, because we're intending on our Discord to run various solo tournaments.
Yeah, I'm super excited about this, Scruffy. I think it's a really fun idea, and we've been toying around with the idea for a while. But yeah, really, it just comes out of the desire to build a community around the podcast. We get lots of feedback from you guys every episode when you write in, and we think it'd be awesome if you could all share your ideas in the same space. So we think a Discord channel through a Patreon would be a perfect place for that. On top of that, yeah, the formal organised tournaments, we'll sort of run them best we can. But yeah, we really want to know what you guys want to play. So there are three tiers you can choose from. So the first one is for £3. For £3, you join our Discord. For £5, you join the Discord and you get to vote on our polls that let you have a say on what we cover on the show and also what tournaments we run. And finally, there's a £10 one. If you want to be fancy, you can get all of that, and you can also get a shout out on the show. So that's sort of what we're aiming to do with Patreon. Scruffy, I don't know about yourself. I'm super excited to see where this goes.
Yeah, absolutely. It'll be really exciting to meet, who's listening to the thing and get to say thank you directly for supporting us. It's exciting times. So I look forward to seeing how that all goes. Right, back to the episode then. Would you give us an overview of Roads and Boats, please, Norm?
So Roads and Boats is a logistics game for 1 to 4 players, designed and published by the team at Splotter. This was published in 1999, and it clocks in at around an hour per player, give or take, depending on experience. This is, as you might expect from a Splotter, a somewhat heavier game. The way the game works is during setup, players will select one of the available maps and then build said map using the hexagonal terrain tiles that are included in the game. On top of the map, players will place a sheet of plexiglass, which allows players to draw on the game using dry erase markers. I'll come on to why that's important in a moment. Players start the game with a handful of resources on their home tile. They also start with 3 transporters and 2 geese, which of course, as everybody knows, geese are used to help you research technology a bit later in the game. It's important to point out that in Roads and Boats, no resources are owned by players unless they are on one of your transporters. There are various types of transporters, including donkeys, carts, trucks, rafts, rowboats, and steamboats. You begin with donkeys, and with the exception of rafts, all other transporters will require research in order to be made. Each transporter has a limit to what they can carry and how far they can travel. Some transporters, like donkeys, for example, can travel further when they're travelling on a road or a bridge, but these must be built by players and are signified by drawing a road on the plexiglass with that dry erase marker I mentioned earlier. Now, the main goal of the game is just to convert your resources into buildings that produce more resources, with the broad idea of eventually creating resources that score you points, like gold, coins, and stock certificates, the latter being worth the most points. So the turn structure in Roads and Boats is very procedural. First, you produce resources, then you move your transporters, then you build buildings with your resources, and then finally, you may contribute towards the wonder. So adjacent to the map, there is a monument or a wonder that's being constructed throughout the game. This is both another way to score points and also an in-game timer. And the Wonder has several roads where bricks can be added to its construction. During the Wonder phase, players can pay any resources that are on their home tile to contribute bricks towards the Wonder. The resource cost goes up every time you contribute during the same phase. At the end of every round, a neutral brick is also added to the Wonder. This progresses the game forward. The game will either end once a certain point of the Wonder is met, or when all neutral bricks have been placed. At the end of the game, you'll score points based on the bricks you've contributed to the Wonder. Scruffy, that's kind of a brief overview of Roads and Boats. Is there anything you'd want to add to that?
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add is that during setup, I think you're able to make your own maps as well. There are preset maps, but I think there is rules in the book for how you can make your own custom maps as well, which is, I think, very exciting, although something that I didn't do for my playthrough.
Yeah, it's something I've not done as well, and I didn't even think to add that into.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting thing. I think it's where I'm going to go next with the game, but we'll get into that later. So, well, we're on the topic of my playthrough. That was a lot of fun. It felt very different to how it plays multiplayer for sure. I mean, I know you did a playthrough as well. I've uploaded mine on my YouTube, but yeah, it felt a lot more isolating than I've ever felt playing a solo game before. I don't know if you felt the same way.
No, elaborate. What do you mean?
So I think perhaps it's because the way that Roads and Boats works solo as opposed to multiplayer is it is just a puzzle. You get a small map and everything is completely deterministic. There isn't any random element that comes and affects you. There isn't another player. There isn't a dummy player. There's no AI. All that happens is every turn, one brick gets put on the Wonder. So it just means you have 20 turns to play the game. But other than that, it's all there. It's all just laid out, and you can and people do just come up with the best strategy and lay it out like clockwork, and anyone who copied that strategy would get the exact same score. And I think because there was no interaction with an external force, it felt to me, as having never played a solo game like that before, it felt really lonely, I had fun while I was doing it, but the more I reflected on it, the more I realized that while I was playing it, I felt like I was solo more than I have ever felt playing a solo game before. I know that sounds a bit weird. How did you feel playing it? Did you feel the same thing or not?
No, I absolutely love the solo game for Roads and Boats. It is one of my favourite solo games. I think it's fantastic. And I think everything you said is correct. It is. We covered the idea of analytical uncertainty briefly in episode 2, I want to say. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was episode 2 when we spoke about Friday. And we spoke about how randomness affects games, and then we spoke about the opposite, which is analytical uncertainty. And this is a fantastic example of it where, like you said, there's no uncertainty in the game. You just have to feel it out. Will be the same every time.
So how does that work, just for people who didn't hear our last episode?
So yeah, no, that's a good shout out. So analytical uncertainty is the idea that the game, although it has no uncertain elements, is still uncertain for us mere mortals who are playing the game, because the level of branching decision making is so complex. You can't work it out without playing through the game. So the only way I can figure out if I can make enough stock certificates to get a high score on Roads and Boats is by playing it. I'm not smart enough to sit down and map it out. So it has to be played through. And because you're not able to see where those decisions are going to go, it's enough uncertainty to still be fun and still be a game. So that's the idea of analytical uncertainty. It's rarer to see than other forms of uncertainty, like randomness or player uncertainty or performative uncertainty, for example, dexterity games. But it's an interesting one, and Roads and Boats does it. Roads and Boats does it so well. I think in the map that I played, it said in the setup, you can only get 3 stock certificates on this map. That is the best you can do. And I've never had a game that sort of makes me work backwards like that before. I immediately thought, okay, well, 3 stock certificates. That means I need 6 coins. So if I need 6 coins, I need 12 pieces of gold. Okay, well, if I need 12 pieces of gold and there are only 3 spaces for mines, then I need... and I've never really had a game work like that. And I kept going backwards until I got to a point where I couldn't figure it out anymore, and I just had to play the game. And by the time I finished the game, I didn't get anywhere near 3 stock certificates. So my all that working out sort of went out the window and wasn't important. So although it sounds like you can kind of work it out and calculate it, actually sitting down and playing through it is completely different. Would you agree?
I had a very similar experience. Yeah, there was a kind of high score on the Splotter site, which I looked at, and I was trying to work out, well, that's an insane score. I'm going to just try and forget that, but I'm just going to try and look at trying to make as many certificates as I can. And my goal for myself was to try and make 2 certificates, which I was close to doing, probably about 2 turns away from, to be honest. I didn't end up making a single one in the end, but it was very close. And I think, yeah, it felt a lot like at the start of the game, you're kind of going on a sort of instinctual thing of, okay, I need to do this, and you set yourself little short-term goals to achieve long-term goals. Like, well, I'm going to need to get a mint, which will make coins. And what does a mint need? It needs fuel. So I need to get fuel. So where do I get fuel from? Well, I could get it from here or here. So there's not much space on the map. So I'm going to get it from this one, which takes less space on the map. And well, that means I need to get... It's many, many steps for one little thing, you know? Yeah. And that's fun, and that's a really fun little puzzle to work out. Even if you don't end up achieving it in the end, it was still quite satisfying watching everything kind of happen during the production phase, and the way the game kind of rewards you for your careful planning and stuff, even if it doesn't work out right. So I imagine once you get really good at it and you finally get to achieve your goals, your end goals, that must be a really satisfying feeling. Yeah, but that being said, I did feel like it was a solo game. It was a real solitary puzzle, and that might sound just right for you listening to this, like something you'd be really, really interested in experiencing. I'm not sure if it's exactly what I look for in a solo game.
I'm glad that we finally disagree on a game, because I absolutely loved it. I think the reason it's not so much of a problem for me is because that's exactly how I feel when I play Roads and Boats anyway, multiplayer. When I sit down to play a multiplayer game, I think, okay, how do I get a stock certificate again? Okay, and what am I going to need to do that? And I work backwards anyway.
That's really interesting, because in a multiplayer game, my first thought is always, how can I steal all their stuff? You know? And that's something that, for me in a multiplayer game, is one of my favorite things. Like in a solo game, you can just drop stuff on the floor. You can let your mines produce gold and just leave it there and pick it up.
It's
Whereas
lovely.
in a solo game, in a multiplayer game, absolutely no, you cannot do that, because someone's going to swoop in with their donkey or their boat and steal your stuff, and that someone is obviously me. Most games,
it is. It's why I think that's why I like it, because I'm just not playing with you anymore.
Totally valid. Yeah.
No, but just for our listeners who haven't played, this is. What Scruffy's saying is something that's really important, because, as I said in the intro and the description of the game, the resources aren't owned by players unless they're on a transporter, and your transporters can only carry so much. So if you will have to leave things lying around, it is possible, depending on turn order, for in a multiplayer game people to come and take your stuff, and that can be extremely, extremely damaging. There are some goods that once taken, you can then not make more of on your own, or sometimes at all. Isn't that right, Scruffy?
Yeah, geese are a great example. Every game I've played with Norm or other people, it's always been a battle for the geese. And if you lose one goose, you only start with 2, and they can only breed if there are 2. If you lose one goose early on, you can't do any research then, because you need 2 geese to do research, unless you steal it back from someone. And they can just steal your goose and use it, or send it off to the wander, and it's gone forever then. It's it's brutal, absolutely horrible. In the game I played solo, I had geese sat in a pasture all game, just making geese. And I had one donkey sat on the home base doing a little goose run across the road, picking it up and dropping it off, picking it up and dropping it, and they would just make a free goose every turn. It was weird.
See, in the game I played, the map was so small that I wasn't able to research. And I think that's the reason why I struggled to make the level of stock certificates I needed, because my mines ran out of gold and you cannot refill them without researching. And I only had 2 geese. I ended up sending off to the Wonder, which I've never done before. But no, I really enjoy the solo experience. I think what it loses in interaction, it makes up for in difficulty. In most multiplayer games, I will make at least 1 stock certificate. In the solitaire games, it's hard to even do that. The reason why is because you only have 20 turns in the solo game. In the multiplayer game, it's a lot more dictated by the players. The most common way for the game to end in multiplayer is when players contribute to the Wonder and they meet that certain point on the monument.
Theoretically, it could go up to, I think there's 33 neutral blocks in a multiplayer game, so it could go on for 33 turns.
Yeah, absolutely. And shrinking that down to only 20 makes a huge difference. I certainly struggled with it. Is that something you found difficult as well?
Definitely. I mean, you think you've got more time, even because just the last turn, that 1 block left, that's the end. You don't get 1 more production, it's over. And you kind of, in my mind anyway, production feels like it happens at the end of the turn, but obviously it happens at the start of the turn. That last block that's your last production turn, and then you're just moving stuff around to put it on your transporter so you can count it as a score. So it's kind of almost 19 turns of production, isn't it? It feels like. Because the first turn you don't produce any goods.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because the way the turn structure works, all the goods that you need that score you points, you do not build, you produce them. So that happens at the start of your turn. So if you're planning to move something, let's say I was planning to move my 2 coins and my piece of paper onto my stock exchange in order to make a stock certificate, I would need to have another turn. I would need to start the next round before I can do that, because I would move them over and then it would produce the next turn. That feels so counterintuitive, but it makes the level of planning so crunchy. I love it.
That's the problem I had. I ended the game with 2 coins and 2 pieces of paper just sat in my home tile and ready to go and make stock certificates. I had another 2 coins about to be produced and stuff, and it was just I couldn't do it because it was the last turn. And the differential in points there is it goes from 2 coins are worth 40 points a pop, and then a stock certificate is worth 120. So that's 40 points differential. It's a big difference. It was quite a disastrous moment where I realized, nope, not going to be able to do it. Not going to even make 1 certificate,
Absolutely. And the way the game ends so brutally, as soon as that, because the last thing that happens on a turn is the Wonder phase. So you go, okay, now we move on to the Wonder phase, and that's it. No more turns. No more. You cannot make that thing that you've just been planning to. It feels like in Roads and Boats, your work is never done. If you were allowed infinite time, you could just keep building up and producing, and it's kind of fun to watch your network that you've created run, but you don't get that many chances for it to run when you're playing solo. So yeah, I really appreciate that extra challenge, but also the shorter playtime. I was amazed at how quickly I was able to play through a couple of games of Roads and Boats when playing solo compared to multiplayer. I think I've played it 3-player and it's taken around 4 hours. I think I played in 45 minutes. That's a huge difference.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just going back to what we were saying about generating your own maps, I'd be really interested to see how that would work, because I think there might be something really fun about generating your own map and knowing it's the first time it was ever played, and it was never seen by anyone in the form that you've played the game. That would be really interesting. And then competing obviously with your own score every time you play it and knowing that you're getting the best score. Yeah, I don't know if that would work, because I feel like the maps are meticulously designed, but it would be really interesting to try out your own little world. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so too. It's not something that I've done, and I think the only reason I haven't is because the maps are so, like you said, meticulously designed, almost to an intimidating point of view. Because when you read a map and it says this is the best you can possibly do, figure it out, idiot. You know?
I think on the Spotify site, on the one I was working on, it said, if you're really struggling to get the solution, click this link and see the solution. I was like, that's assuming that most people are just going to, oh, yeah, easy, I can figure that out, no problem. Nowhere close. I think the highest score on the one I did was 500 and something, 580 maybe, and I ended up scoring 138. So I think the skill cap for this game is massive, but maybe it just sort of clicks after a couple of playthroughs. Both of us are pretty inexperienced with the game. Maybe we just need to play it a bit more and figure out a few sort of cheat codes to what you're working towards in general. But it feels like the sort of thing you could devote your entire life to and get so much replayability out of, you know?
Absolutely. And okay, so I posted a picture of Roads and Boats on my Instagram after I went through my last playthrough, and the caption I put was, "I want to play every map multiple times." I can't wait to dive into it, because that feeling of getting better at a solo game is one of my favorite things about solo gaming. And like you said, the gap that there is for you to improve into is huge. And I spoke about that and how much I enjoyed that aspect of Mage Knight in the episode when we covered Mage Knight. And I feel like this is even greater. It certainly feels like the game rewards experience and multiple plays.
It's interesting how the score works, that depending on what map you're choosing depends on what the score means. So in some of the maps, it's easier to get a higher score. In some of them, you can't achieve the same score because of the way the map's laid out and the way you have to build and the way the resources are limited. I think that's kind of fascinating, that you can't always say, if you score over 100, then you're doing pretty well at the game, because, well, no, it depends on what map you pick. So if you do generate your own personal map, who knows what the score for good is? There's no kind of benchmark there until you upload it and get somebody who knows how to play the game to do it.
And I looked at one of the small world maps on the Splotter site, and I read through the description, and it said you cannot make a stock certificate on this map. You will get a good score by contributing to the wonder. And I thought, wow, I've never even played the game like that, multiplayer or solo. And the fact that the maps that you choose at the beginning really constrain you, really constrain what you can do, and make you think, okay, I have to work within these constraints, and it's never going to be the same if you choose a different map every time. I think that's fantastic, and that multiplies even greater, like you said, if you were to choose your own map. I think that's wonderful.
Yeah. I just want to talk about because obviously, the puzzle side of it works brilliantly, and it is a masterclass in analytical uncertainty. But I feel like half of the game is completely stripped away in this, or it morphs into a completely different game. Because like I say, and like I've kind of hinted on earlier, for me, Roads and Boats is not just about making a really cool engine and trying to puzzle out how to get the most stock certificates. It's also this area control game where you're moving your donkeys around and you're building. I mean, there's even walls and the way the road system works to steal from other players. But walls aren't at all built in solo, obviously, because you wouldn't ever need to wall anyone off from your stuff. I feel like it's really interesting that is all just completely lost in the solo game. And I'm thinking that next time I play, I might want to try applying one of the solo systems that I've seen mentioned on Board Game Geek and stuff, where you can make any multiplayer game solo using the system. The one I'm looking at the moment is it's just called the Solo System by Chad Mestag. And all that system is it's a couple of decks of cards that you flip over to determine how the AI will operate. So in essence, you're playing against yourself, which makes it seem like you're only able to decide on moves your opponent can take that you notice. Yeah, so I mean, I'll have to have a look at how that system works and whether that brings back that element to solo play in Roads and Boats, or maybe some other solo systems out there I could bring in and recapture the area control aspect of the game for a solo playthrough.
That'd be interesting. I'd love to hear what you think of that. For me, I love player interaction. I love meaningful player interaction. Roads and Boats is one of my favourite multiplayer games for that reason. However, I am so happy just making my own network, and that probably makes me sound like a bit of a Care Bear, but I'm certainly not. I love heavily interactive games, Cutthroat, 18xx, etc. But the network building and the logistics side of Roads and Boats is so satisfying on its own that playing it solo, I'm completely fine with it being removed. I know it's a completely different game, but I'm really happy with what's left. What's left is a really well-designed, interesting, and intricate network of crunchy decisions that I could easily spend a whole evening by myself, just moving around my donkeys and my geese and my trucks and boats. It's brilliant. And I think one of the reasons I enjoy it so much as well, it's not just the satisfaction of watching that happen, and I'll probably get a lot of stick for this, but I love the artwork. I know a lot of people don't, but it's so whimsical. Even talking about it now, moving around donkeys and having your geese follow them, it's it's so charming to look at and to play. I can't help but feel happy when I'm playing Roads and Boats, and whether that's multiplayer or solo, it's fine. It's great both times. In fact, with the multiplayer game, because the interactions can be so cutthroat, I have to really be in the mood to play one. Whereas I think playing solo gives me the chance to get it to the table more often. So yeah, I'm sorry to hear that it negatively impacted your ability to enjoy it by stripping away those things. But for me, I didn't have a problem with it at all.
So I think for me, it felt more like when you play like a base builder video game, something like RimWorld or one of the games where you build your own little colony up. But imagine a game like that, but then with no random external elements. It kind of it threw out a lot of the life for me, and I think that's true with most solo board games. Like I'm glad you brought up 18xx because it's an interesting analogy when you look at something like the game we looked at last episode, Railway Station, which takes the cutthroat nature of an 18xx game and kind of removes that, gives you the map and says, okay, you need to build the routes, and that's the main focus. But then it does put it back into some extent, and the frustration that the other players can cause to you, the external kind of randomness can cause to you, is put back in with the dice, which might not behave how you need them to every turn. Roads and Boats has none of that. There is the only frustration is your own poor planning, and there's nothing else to kind of blame on the fact that you didn't get that certificate. And I mean, I think that's, it's neither good nor bad. It's whether you like that sort of thing, if you prefer that sort of thing. For me, I would have thought before, I went into it thinking I'm going to really like that because I've always had a problem with randomness in games before. But it meant that it felt like there was no interaction with the game. It was all an interaction within my own head. It was all a planning exercise, a logistics exercise. And I didn't realize how much that would sap the life out of it for me, or the personality maybe.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. It does absolutely come down to preference. Personally, I'm a fan of both. I like randomness in my solo games, but also this worked so well. One of the things I think having 100% agency and no random element, one of the things that brings, because obviously we've spoken about what it takes away and what you're losing from the multiplayer game. But one of the things that it brings, I think, is really fantastic stories. When you look back and go, and you know exactly where you messed up because it is all you're doing. When you look back and you can point to it, that makes for such a good story. I mean, the first thing you did when you finished your playthrough is you got on to our chat and was like, this just happened to me, I needed one more turn. That kind of excitement of, I realised where I messed up, I want to play again. I love that feeling. And that's something that it adds, that if there was that external factor or the randomness factor, like if it had a similar system to Railway Station where it lost the interaction but it put it back in through some external randomness, you would lose that ability to point back and say, this is exactly where I went wrong. And I think when you figure it out and have that aha moment, like, that's how you get better at games. And I really like that. And I'm not saying that that's necessary. I'm not saying that if your game has randomness in it, that you're not going to have those moments, because you will still have those moments, but it's amplified and magnified in an experience like this. And that's one thing I really did enjoy about it.
That's really interesting. I mean, I went away from the game thinking that it would be the sort of thing I'd have in my head as a kind of, okay, well, I'll work out how I could have optimized it and I'll work out where I went wrong. But the only conclusion I kept coming to, and maybe it is just an inexperienced thing, and maybe if I play the game a lot more, I'll get better at this and I'll enjoy it more, this side of it, is that I kept going away thinking, I don't know. I have no idea. Like, my first thought was maybe I shouldn't have, because what I did was I bred my donkeys right at the start to get all 5 donkeys out. Maybe I shouldn't have done that. Maybe that was a waste of turns. Don't know. No idea. Haven't got the foggiest idea whether that's a good idea or not. I'd have to try it. And I think because it's difficult to anticipate what that would lead to, because, like you say, the paths are so divergent, it's really hard to pinpoint what might be an optimal move for me at the moment. And I think because of that and that total uncertainty, and that I'd have to play every single iteration of the game to get anywhere close to knowing what I'm doing, I think, or maybe at least that's how it feels. It's probably not true. I could probably play maybe 3 or 4 times on the same map and start going, things start clicking, start chunking into place, and maybe I'd be there. But at the moment, I'm sat in a position where I have no idea what I did that made me get such a vastly lower score, and what I could have done to make it better. Maybe when I watch through my playthrough and edit the video for the YouTube, then I'll see it. And by the time this podcast comes out, I'll have to I'll be typing away in the description saying, "Don't listen to me, I'm an idiot." But for now, that's where I'm sat. That's what I'm thinking. I haven't, besides thinking maybe I should have bred the donkeys, I haven't gone through the turns in my head like I do with some other games where I go, well, what could I have done differently? How could I have maximized that turn? Or even playing multiplayer games against other people, I go, I should have done this differently. For example, Scythe is an example where I would think about how I've played the turns and how I could have optimized the opening for the different factions to get the top and bottom rows as quick as possible, both firing at the same time. None of that clicked with this game, and I'm not sure why.
It's interesting because my playthrough all came down to... So at the beginning, I felt very zen. Okay, so I didn't really think too much as to how I'm going to complete my main goal. Like you said, you set sort of mini goals for yourself. And that's probably one area we're going wrong immediately. We probably should have a lot more steps worked out than what we do. But again, that's experience. But because we're working on small goals, I feel really zen pushing my donkeys around and really satisfied watching one good convert into other goods, and it's nice. And then you get to about 10 turns left, and then things start to ramp up. And that's one thing I do like about the game as well. It's a really nice progression because there aren't too many decisions to make at the beginning. But then as you have a bigger network of transporters and more resources and more buildings producing more goods, it becomes very difficult to know what would be the correct decision. And my playthrough came down to, I built a road somewhere I wish I had the option to build it on one tile or the other. I built it on one tile because it meant that I could build a building quicker. But it meant at the end of the game, it wasn't necessary to have on that turn. But I did it because I could see the initial benefit. Had I chosen the other one, I would have been able to get that stock certificate by the end of the game. As I didn't, I wasn't able to. And that was all my fault. And I love that. And there's probably a lot more that I've done wrong, but when there's key moments like that you messed up, that makes me just want to get it back to the table again. And that's something that happened to me on my playthrough.
Yeah, that's cool. I had a similar thing where I wish I'd built a road and didn't.
You never know. You never know in the turn. You never know until retrospectively, and I think that's a standard through most Splotter games, at least the ones that I've played anyway. Not many of them that I've played are soloable, so the fact that this one is, and it keeps that key element of player agency and you've only got yourself to blame kind of thing, I really enjoyed that.
That's it. I think perhaps it's just maybe it's just an issue of new player friendly ability. Maybe it needs to have some ego boosting score markers, so instead of just aiming for the top score, I can feel proud of myself for getting not the very lowest score, or I can aim for sort of different benchmarks on the maps. I mean, I don't know how that would work out, especially because, like we say, each map is totally different. Perhaps as a kind of exercise in beating yourself at the thing, it would be fun. Maybe just trying to get a higher score than you got last time, and then you can feel good about that at least. But because the only score you've got to compete against is such a lofty goal, and yeah, it feels difficult. A bit of a knock to my ego, maybe.
Do you think that affected your enjoyment?
Perhaps, yeah. I mean, I'm only human. I like to think I'm above my own ego, but who is really? I like to win at games. Can't help it.
Yeah. I think I kind of assumed that I wouldn't get close to the score that they advertised, or the score that they said you should aim for. I think that maybe helped.
I did too, but it's just that because that's the only context you have for the map. You're told, here's the map, here's the best score, see if you can get it. And it's like, well, of course you're not going to get it especially if you're new to the game. I mean, unless you're an absolute genius or you really luck into it, it's going to be very, very unlikely you're going to get it. So yeah, it's brutal.
So for the sake of our listeners, would you say if they were to play the game to take that score to one side and just worry about beating their own score?
Yeah, I think ideally you should, if you can avoid it, not look at the top score. That's one thing I realized when I saw the top score. I thought, well, that's going to be in my head now, and I wish I hadn't seen it. And maybe that's part of one of the draws to me about making your own map, is that you don't know what the top score can be for that map. So whatever you get, that's the score that you got, and then you are just competing with yourself. I think to some extent, removing it from the context of the highest score is potentially would be a benefit to people with fragile egos like myself. But I mean, you can enjoy it even knowing that. So maybe that's just me. It could just be a Scruffy thing.
Maybe. I can definitely see your point. I think for me, one of the ways I like to engage with solo games is I like to see myself improve. I like games where there's a community of people who obsess over it, like Mage Knight, for example, where we talk about, I mean, I like to think, I don't know it as well as others, but compared to other games that I play, I know Mage Knight inside out. And with Roads and Boats, the fact that when you start the scenario, it says, this is the very best you're going to do. And I know that there are people out there who know exactly how to do that. That's something really cool to aim for. And when you can see direct improvement like that, that makes me really happy. It makes me want to jump on Board Game Geek and just look at how everyone does it. But I don't want to do it because I don't want to spoil it for myself. So maybe once I've played it, I don't know, as much as I've played something like Mage Knight, maybe then I'll start joining in that conversation. But the fact that exists, that really excites me. I don't know, maybe that's silly, but that's just how I like to interact with solo games, I think.
That's interesting. That's really interesting. I think part of the thing for me is that I need to feel a conversation with the solo game I'm playing to some extent. And I don't feel that with Roads and Boats. The only conversation I feel it has is that high score. So the only conversation it feels like to me playing the game is, that was a pathetic attempt. Whereas if we talk about something like Mage Knight, the conversation you're having isn't necessarily with the score. I mean, it is to some extent, but mainly it's with the dummy player while you're playing the game.
Yeah.
That is the personability in the game. The personality comes from while you're playing the game. The whole time you're trying to make sure you get the tempo right, so you're not getting taken over by the dummy player, and you've got something to blame if things aren't going right. And obviously the randomness gives you another sort of interactivity there. And then finally you get the meta interactivity of the score at the end, which is within a context of your past scores and other games. And that's just one part of the kind of conversation within the game. With Roads and Boats, there is no conversation. It is just that score. It is just the meta critique, and that felt a bit depressing for me, I guess. Not majorly, but only kind of on reflection. I mean, when I actually played the game, I enjoyed the puzzle and I had fun playing it. I like the table that I set up for myself on Tabletop Sim and fiddling around with all the minis, and the art and the theme is great. I've tried to keep the art in the tiles I made on the table I've got, and yeah, at once it feels like it wants to be a relaxing and nice and encouraging thing, but then the only feedback you've got from the thing, or that I got from the thing, was that score.
That's actually really interesting, and the more that I think about it, the more you sort of explain why you felt the way you feel, the more I think that actually Roads and Boats is a very versatile system. We've already said about how it allows you to create your own maps. The maps are completely, the hexagonal tiles aren't stuck together. You can arrange them in whatever order, your brain can think of. For a game with such a versatile system, I don't understand why there isn't, like scenarios, different winning conditions, AI player.
Yeah, it feels like it's one game that would benefit from not just being a score-based thing. Perhaps you could have a system where you have to make a certificate in as few turns as possible. That would be interesting. It feels like it's missing something, especially within the solo experience where it's taking away the player interaction and not replacing it with anything. Yeah, you're right. I think it could do with scenarios, or it could do with something that allows for you to create your own map and still have a way to measure success. Maybe it's not score based, maybe it's something else. I don't know what, but yeah, that's a definite design challenge for sure.
Yeah, and I'm even imagining something where it changes the way it plays, because like I said, it's such a versatile system. I'm imagining things like opponent's donkey starting the other side of the map and moving one space towards you and building up, and you have to, I don't know, construct walls to block them off and build a certain amount of the wonder in before they get to your home base or something, for example. There are lots of things you can do with roads and boats, and that was just off the top of my head. It was probably a terrible idea. That was just something that came to me whilst you were talking. The system is set up to be changed and altered already. It seems kind of unusual that for the solo game they've just gone get a score.
Yeah, I'd like to make it really clear that the game itself is one of my favorite games ever. I absolutely love the game, and I feel like it's got so much potential, which is why I was kind of felt a bit let down by the fact that the solo mode doesn't, for me, offer what I need, in a game. But I would absolutely still recommend trying it out. There's I'll put links to all this in the description, but I've got a tabletop sim mod which I've set up using the models and assets from another table and a tile set that I've kind of whipped together myself. That's really fun to play on, so you can try it for free there if you've got tabletop sim. I know the game's actually quite hard to get a hold of a hard copy of, but yeah, it's an experience for sure.
Yeah, and I have a hard copy. I have the 20th anniversary edition, which comes with all the expansion material, which I haven't even touched. I haven't even punched out the expansion material because there's so much in the base game. There's so much replay value just in the base game, and not only does the game come with a book of maps, and not only can you make your own, but I went on Board Game Geek and on the Splotter website, and they have much more for you to try as well. So I'll link scenario book with some ones made by Splotter, some ones that come with the base game, and also some fan made ones as well. I'll put that in the description because it's super fun. Yeah, and I think we can't talk about Roads and Boats without talking about the box art, right?
Oh yeah, I think that a lot of people are put off by that, and I don't understand why either. Like you say, I think it's an absolutely beautiful game. I love the hand drawn aesthetic. The font choice is a bit weird. I'm not a fan of that. But yeah, I tried to keep in the tile sets I made up. I tried to keep that sort of simplistic top-down view. I think it really makes the world just nice and calm and relaxing. It's good.
Excellent. No, I completely agree. If you haven't seen the Roads and Boats box art before, you should look it up. It was, from what I understand, done by one of the designers' ex-partners at the time, and apparently when they left Splotter, part of the agreement was that they wouldn't change the art, and I think that's...
They shouldn't change the art. It's beautiful.
No, and I hope that story is true as well, because that's absolutely lovely. And that in this sort of age of board games with Kickstarter and all these other bells and whistles you get, it's nice to see such simplistic, childlike, whimsical art on the cover of such a successful game. It makes me happy. Okay, so yeah, moving on from Roads and Boats and just sort of opening the topic up a little bit broader, I've sort of in my notes I've written down different ways that designers and that games translate themselves from being an interactive multiplayer game down to a solo game, and I wanted to sort of share my thoughts on that with yourself, Scruffy, and just see what you think about these. See if you agree with my five, or if you can think of any more. And of course, if I miss anything, see if the listeners can let us know what we've missed. But these are sort of the five main ways that I could remember interactive games translate themselves into solo games. So the first one, I feel like this is a good one to start with because Roads and Boats does this, is a timer. So a lot of interactive games will add an additional timer in order to make the game harder. This is to compensate for the fact that players can't mess around with your intentions or your plans. Now, we've spoken about that in Roads and Boats, and you also briefly mentioned the dummy player in Mage Knight, and that's another really good example of an in-game timer that is made specifically for the solo mode in order to make the game harder. Other than Mage Knight and Roads and Boats, are there any others that you can think that do that kind of thing, Scruffy?
Yeah, I think I can't think of a single solo game that doesn't give you a number of turns that you do things in. Usually it's very direct. It's you have an event deck and you go through one at a time, or every turn you just cross off a turn. You know how long most solo games are going to end. I think that is something a bit different to a lot of multiplayer games that don't have that. But I mean, there are also a lot that do. So yeah, turn timers is a very common thing in solo games and in multiplayer games.
Absolutely. What I'm talking about specifically is that the way timers are implemented in things like Mage Knight and Roads and Boats is it is there to make things more difficult for the solo player to compensate for the fact that there would normally be a player interacting with them. So in Roads and Boats, for example, there's the threat of having your resources stolen from you when you're playing multiplayer. There is none of that threat in the solo game. So in order to make the game harder again, they give you less turns than they do in the multiplayer game. We've already spoken about how it gives the players much less time to fulfill their plans, and I think that that's the reason, although there's no attempt to recreate what the player does, but it is to balance out the difficulty, because it would otherwise be much, much easier.
So it's the variability in difficulty there. I think a lot of solo games or games that have been ported over to being solo keep the same pacing as their multiplayer version. Robinson Crusoe, for example, has the same sort of turn structure, whether you're playing multiplayer or not. Same with This War of Mine. Mage Knight, the dummy player is designed to simulate a player as close as possible. So, sometimes they'll be moving faster, sometimes they'll be moving slower in a very clever way. And that kind of randomness is simulated to be as close to the multiplayer version as possible. Roads and Boats, like you say, does it a bit differently. It uses that variability and difficulty to make solo more challenging. Yeah, that's interesting.
Excellent. Yeah, no, I'm glad you think so. The next one, the second one that I wrote down was something we've already spoken about, which is an AI. And I've written in my notes like my own little definition. Again, I didn't research this, so if you listeners think I'm way off, then feel free to let me know. I've defined it as a system or a set of rules that are followed in order to make decisions for an artificial player that you are trying to beat. I think that's a really important one, because there are a lot of games where sort of random things happen, and I'll come on to that in a moment, but you're still trying to beat your own score. You're not trying to beat somebody else's score. So a couple of examples I've given here are things like Anachrony. Have you ever played Anachrony solo, Scruffy?
Not solo. I've played it with you, obviously multiplayer, but I've never played it solo. I've tried to start it up a few times, but just got distracted or forgotten the rules. The problem with Anachrony is the components are kind of very overwhelming.
Yeah.
I think it's a difficult game to get into. Once you do, it's a really fun game, and I've heard really good things about how the AI works in that to simulate a player.
Yeah, and for listeners who haven't played Anachrony, it has this really interesting system where the AI has their own player board, and on their player board is like a rondel of possible actions that the AI can take. You will see that board with tokens numbered 1 to 6, and you will roll a die. That you then take the corresponding action and you move the action across on the rondel. So what can happen is they begin to stack up. So one action becomes a lot more likely. So you can kind of predict what the AI is going to do, but also they can make decisions that you don't expect. So it's very much like playing against a real player, where you've got an idea of what they're going to do and what they're more likely to do, but that doesn't mean they're going to do it, which I think is really nice and also very simple to manage. I think it's tricky with an AI because I've played some games where, with an Automa deck, for example, where you flip a card over and you have to kind of somewhat make decisions for them. And it kind of feels like you're playing both sides of the table, and that's obviously not the intention with AIs. Have you ever encountered a game with an AI at all?
Well, that thing you just said there about that you flip over a card, it goes back to what we mentioned earlier in the episode. The solo system that I'm really keen to give a go at. That is literally what it is. It's a system where you make the decisions for the AI, so you're playing against yourself. And I wonder to what extent, I haven't tried it yet, but I wonder to what extent that makes them very predictable, because the game state, you can imagine, and you know exactly what they're thinking and what they're planning. I mean, imagine trying to apply it to something like chess, which relies on strategy and misdirection. How could you possibly do that against yourself? You can't. I mean, any game that relies on hidden information or hidden strategy is going to be very difficult to use a system like that, an AI that relies on you as the player to make the decisions for the AI, because you're removing that element of player randomness. I mean, to some extent what they are looking at doing.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I don't know how the solo system handles that, because I think you said earlier in the episode they can only make moves that you can see, because I think you make the final decision for them. I think the idea is that their cards prompt their decision, and you have to sort of work that out. So I don't know. Without playing it, it's hard to see.
AIs are definitely a massive part of making a multiplayer soloable. It's really hard to get it right, make it unpredictable, but at the same time relevant, so it's not just going to move completely randomly depending on the game state, because that would be too easy. I think some AIs fall into that trap a little bit. I'm thinking particularly of things I've heard about the Scythe AI, where it will just attack even though it might not have a chance to win, which feels quite exploitable for the player. It's hard to get that balance right.
Yeah, no, I can imagine it's really tough to design, and there are people who are paid just to design automa decks for games, which I think is an awesome way to earn a living. We've actually played against an AI together. I wonder if you can guess the game or remember the play.
Played against an AI together. Oh, I know what you mean, Volker.
Yeah, we played against General Volker in Mage Knight.
Yeah, the way he moves is kind of interesting, because you get some sort of, what he can do, and it's quite simple. All the things that he can do is quite simple, so he's never going to do anything totally unpredictable.
And because the random element is a deck of cards, it has a memory. You won't shuffle his deck of cards. Like a lot of automa decks, once you go through them, you shuffle them. With General Volker, you probably won't get to the bottom of his deck.
I think that's important, because it means that as opposed to something like rolling a dice to decide his action, you don't know the probability, or it's hard to work out the probability that he will do any given thing, unless you're counting the cards and trying to, you can get a kind of vague feeling for it, which I think is the best way to have an AI work, where you kind of get an instinct for, well, I've seen a lot of red cards come up, so I don't think he's going to attack, but there's still a couple in his deck, so he might. And that sort of, that is similar to how you feel about another player. They've just done this, so they might do this. But it does keep the randomness there. That card might come up. There might be another red card come up.
Absolutely. And it's interesting how Volker is still a timer, because if you do let him go through his deck, he's going to win the scenario. But he doesn't time you per round, so you have more flexibility than you do with a dummy player. So it's interesting that he falls into actually two of the categories that we mentioned already, but in a very different way to the dummy player. The next one I could think of was a restriction of choice. So when you're playing solo, you have a lot of freedom to choose what you want to do. In multiplayer games, whether you're drafting or placing workers or whatever it is you're doing, that isn't the case. So a lot of solo games will, in order to compensate for the fact you can choose what you want, they will restrict your number of choices. The best example of this I could think of, and also we covered it on the show, so I thought I'd bring it up again, was a Feast for Odin, where between rounds you block the spaces. So if you place a worker there, you can't use that space for another 2 rounds. It's very easy to track and something like that. But yeah, so basically it's a set of rules put in place in order to restrict your choice to compensate for the lack of of player interaction. I couldn't think of any other examples like this off the top of my head, but there's got to be some, right? There's a lot of drafting games, worker placement games. Something must do something similar to this. I don't know if you know.
I mean, that was the first thought that came to my head as well when you mentioned restrictive choices, Feast for Odin. And I think it's about, like we said in the previous episode, that it's about sacrificing choice because you get the benefit of predictability. An interesting kind of counterpoint to that is something like Gloomhaven, which can't really take away from your choice, and you do still get the predictability that you can, if you're playing two-handed, for example, in solo Gloomhaven, you can still see what's coming, what the other player character is going to do. And the way it accounts for that is it just literally makes the game harder. I don't know if that's one on your other things, is just literally makes the scenario more difficult. If you're playing solo, you increase the level of all the enemies by 1.
No, that wasn't something I'd done. And I think the reason I didn't think of that is because when I was thinking of interaction, I was thinking about negative interaction, like blocking a space or doing, I was thinking of a competitive format. So things like scenario difficulty or, Gloomhaven and those kind of games, that didn't even really cross my mind because I was thinking about how designers compensate for the lack of player interaction. I wasn't really thinking of cooperatives. So actually, no, it's not on the list, but that is a different form of interaction that I didn't even consider. And that's a really good point. So I'm glad you brought that up. But no, if I was to consider cooperative games and the interaction that's in them, one thing that I would have put on the list would have been playing multiple characters. Gloomhaven does that, and also things like Spirit Island. We've had a number of listeners write into us to say that we should actually, I should try the game, and B, when I do, I should play it with two spirits, because the game relies on interaction between players, and when you're playing solo, you won't get that if you just play one character. It isn't something I've written on my list, but if I was to consider cooperative games, that is one design choice that I have seen come up quite a lot where people play, I think they call it multi-handed. The next one, not sure how to describe this one, but I've written it down. I've categorized it just as randomness. No, hear me out here. So the example I've put down is the roll and write game that I can never pronounce, Ganz Schon Clever. Forgive me if that's incorrect. Now, in that game, you have to take your turn as the inactive player. But when playing solo, you have to replicate what the other player would have left you with. Now, the reason I didn't categorize this as an AI, and I think the reason I haven't is because you're not trying to beat anyone. It's not like you take your turn as the inactive player and then the AI bot scores some points, You just have to replicate through randomness what your choices are. Does that make sense to you, Scruffy?
I don't know if all AIs need to necessarily score points, but I think having some sort of presence makes it feel more like an AI to me, where either it does actions that deny you spaces, or it does actions that, like for example, in the Mage Knight dummy player, that you can see and you can sort of interact with. I think that makes it an AI to me. In Gantz, it's more, it is just random. Yeah, it's just something that happens externally, kind of like a card draw. I wouldn't call like a deck of event cards an AI. It's just random effectors, isn't it?
Yeah, and that level of randomness doesn't exist in the multiplayer game, because what is left is deliberately left by the other players. It's not random, it's player uncertainty. So it might, obviously you won't know what you're left with until you're left with it. So there's uncertainty, but it's player-driven uncertainty. It's not random. Whereas in the solo game, to emulate that, it is entirely random. Now, it's interesting you call the dummy player Mage Knight an AI, because I don't think I would, because it doesn't have, like you said, doesn't have any presence. It is just a timer. It does just time your rounds. And yeah, I would categorize Volcare as an AI, but the dummy player not. And
that's really interesting, because I feel like Volcare is an AI in the exact same way the dummy player is an AI, which is to say that it is a deck of cards that you have some ability to predict and some interaction with. I think you have even more direct interaction with the dummy player, where you get to to some extent influence what cards and crystals are left at the end of the round, so that go into their possession, into their kit. And I think that interactivity for me is what makes them a dummy player, as opposed to just this thing you were talking about, the random effector, I guess.
Yeah, I just see it as an interactive timer, a timer that you can alter, but it doesn't have any agency. Volcare can attack you. Volcare can take units from the offer. Volcare can block spaces on the board. Volcare makes decisions about things on the map, whereas a dummy player just times you. And I'm not saying that's bad. It's lovely. It's one of my favorite timers. But I just think it's interesting how you would consider an AI. I don't think I would. But
so for you, an AI is about what it affects, not how it works.
Yeah, so I think you said it's an AI because you can interact with it. I wouldn't say that fits my definition. I think
that's interesting. I'm not sure if I'm right about that, but yeah, it's funny we have two different gut feelings about what constitutes an AI. I'd be really interested to get feedback from you guys listening about what you think makes an AI.
Absolutely, and I want to make it very clear. I did no research when I wrote down this list. that was a conscious decision. I thought to myself, what I want our listeners to know my experience with playing games that are supposed to be interactive solo and what I've seen. If I've missed anything, it's a good chance for you guys to educate me. I don't want to ask a bunch of strangers online. I'd rather ask our listeners. So if we are missing something, or if our definitions of AI are incorrect, then feel free to let us know. Okay, so that kind of moves us on to our final one, which this is kind of just a miscellaneous folder, which you might think is a bit lazy, but what I've called it is games that completely change their rules in order to make their interactive games solo. An example that I've picked is 1862, which we've played together multiplayer. Do you know how the solo game works at all?
No, I don't know. So would it be, as opposed to miscellaneous, maybe an upheaval, an overhaul or something?
Yeah, absolutely. So they've thrown out the conventions of the multiplayer game and they've made the game different so it's playable solo, and to the point where it doesn't feel like you're playing the same game anymore. You could argue that other ones fall into this category, but the example I have of 1862 will probably better explain what I have in mind. So the way it works solo is they've just completely overhauled the way you purchase shares. Instead of being able to just purchase the share you want, they've created this kind of mini game where you shuffle the shares and you have to pick one from the bottom of the grid. There's ways for you to move them around, but they created this entire separate mini game just for the solo experience. It doesn't emulate an AI or an additional player. It just adds a wrinkle that makes funding your companies difficult. And I think that's really interesting because it doesn't fit into any of the other categories that I've mentioned. They've just overhauled the rules so that it can be played solo. Part of me thinks that's a little bit forced. Part of me thinks it's very clever. Where do you stand on games that do that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think a lot of games do that. Like, I'm thinking things like Founders of Gloomhaven and Roads and Boats to some extent even. But they all play... They take away a fundamental thing from the multiplayer experience and kind of don't replace it with anything other than a generic timer. And that's it. And they just say, okay, the game's different now. It's not a interactive game anymore. It is now a solo puzzle, maybe with some random elements. In the case of Roads and Boats, no, not with any random elements. And that massive overhaul can make it a complete shift and almost like it's like you say, it's a completely new, different experience. I'm not sure how I feel about that. I think my experience with Roads and Boats makes me think it might need to account for the players in other ways. I don't think it can just strip them out and let you get on with it, and for me still be a fun game. But obviously for other people, like you've made it very clear that you really like how Roads and Boats plays solo, and maybe prefer removing the players.
It's interesting. I'm kind of in two minds about games that do this. On one hand, I really appreciate that they've gone to that level of consideration for solo players. On the other hand, I wonder, is it worth it? Is it better? If it's that much better played multiplayer, then is it worth creating all these extra rules just to make it soloable? Specifically with 18xx, I see a lot of players online saying, I don't have an 18xx group, but I'm interested in playing. Should I buy 1862 because it has a solo mode? And I think you're not going to learn how to play the game, so no.
Yeah, I mean, I think to some extent, like, one of the best things you can do is what Kendall did and make a different, a new game based on the mechanics of that system, but just completely strip it bare and make it into something completely different, like a roll and write or whatever. Or yeah, I mean, it feels a bit strange to take something and strip away a lot of the game, which is the player interaction and what that brings, and then just say, there we go, it's the same game. Still, it's not the same game. You've made a completely different game.
Yeah. Now, there's a lot of there's probably other categories on how people make interactive games solo I haven't touched on. I'd love for you guys to get in contact and let me know. Specifically, I was trying to think of a game with an auction that is played solo, and I couldn't think of any that I've played. So if any of you guys have done that, I would love to hear about it, because I'd be really interested to know how it was done, what mechanics were used. I can't think of any way to do that, but I haven't played one with an auction in, so I'd love to hear about it. Write in, let us know. We'd love to hear about it.
So that brings us towards the end of the episode, where we will ask a question and take responses from last episode's questions and any other comments which you've emailed into Norm.
Excellent. So first of all, let's start off with this week's question.
So this week's question is, what is your favourite AI system in a game, and why is that? What does it bring to the solo experience? What does it account for from the multiplayer experience?
Excellent. So you had a couple of replies from last episode, and I'll go through those now. The first one I'd like to go through is from Brian, who emailed in he commented in on the previous episode, so he's written back again. So first of all, thanks for writing in again, Brian. You rock. He says, "Hi guys, thanks for bringing up my comment on the last episode, even though it wasn't through the official channel. I mostly emailed to express my appreciation for your open interaction with the listeners, but while I'm at it, here's my answer to episode 5's question. I suggest you guys check out the print-and-play Western adventure game called The Drifter. It's low-priced, but has a huge amount of content and replayability. It doesn't take itself too seriously and manages to be both immersive and silly at the same time. I look forward to more episodes and to playing Railway Station, which I just printed out. Keep up the great work."
Nice. What an awesome comment. Yeah. What was the question last episode?
It was, what print and play should we cover next?
Brilliant. Perfect. So yeah, we'll definitely check that out. I think I've heard somebody else mention that in the past as well and rate it highly. So Drifter. Yeah, that's on my to play list for sure.
Yeah, same. And how awesome is it that Brian went ahead and printed off Railway Station after we finished speaking about it?
That's so cool. Treat, Brian, if you haven't played it already.
Yeah, you absolutely have to let us know what you think of the game, because we're big fans. We won't be offended if you don't like it, so no, there's no pressure at all. But let us know what you think. It's I don't know if you've played any train games before, Brian, and if you haven't, that would make it even more interesting to know what you thought of the game. But you absolutely rock for printing it off, and thank you for writing in again. Okay, so the next message we received through our Facebook Messenger. Do you remember Glyn? He wrote in way, way back in episode 2. He was one of the first people to write in.
Yeah, I remember Glyn.
Hey, well, he's back. So Glyn wrote in and said, he wrote in actually just as we recorded episode 5, but before it was released. So just to give you an idea of the time there. So he said, "Hey guys, just got up with the latest episode. Really enjoyed them again. But dear God, this war of mine sounds traumatic. Keep up the good work." He goes on to say, as I had a little bit back and forth asking what he's been playing. He said he's been playing a lot of Burgle Bros, which I've not played before. He says it's an excellent co-op, and although I lost because I was trapped in a little room, the only options available were to use the dynamite or do nothing. You can figure out what I did. He goes on to say, that in Vietnam we just finished school, so it's been very hectic, but a proper holiday now before we move on. He's moving to Oman, so I don't know if you remember about Glyn, but he moves about quite a bit. So there'll be plenty of time for games. Do we have any print and play solo recommendations? Well, that was before episode 5 was released, where we highly recommend Railway Station. So please, obviously, feel free to give that a go. Glenn.
Yeah, I also hear Drifter's pretty good as a
Yeah, we also heard good things about the Drifter. See, this is the thing that when you guys sign up to our Discord, you'll be able to share those recommendations to each other without having to go indirectly through this podcast.
Yeah, no, there's a whole bunch, isn't there? I mean,
you're spot on. There's a bunch. I actually joined a print and play board gaming group on Facebook, and I asked for some recommendations, and the list is as long as my arm. There are just so many, and I'm really looking forward to trying them all. The last episode that we did about Railway Station was pretty successful, and we're actually aiming to cover a new print and play game every 5 episodes we've agreed, Scruffy?
Yeah, we said every 5 episodes. I'm actually really tempted to bring that up a bit. Let us know what you think about whether we should do more than every 5 episodes there. I think we could definitely pull out more than every 5 episodes. There's a few I'm burning to talk about.
It's a good goal to set ourselves, and it's something that we don't see covered a lot in too many other podcasts. It's there are plenty about the top 100, so it's nice for us to be able to shine light on some lesser known games, and we enjoy them a lot ourselves as well. So that's always fun. That's everything that we received from our listeners since last episode. Scruffy, do you want to hit them up again with the question for this week's episode?
Yep. So the question for this week's episode is: What's the best AI system you've seen in a solo game, and why? What does it account for and bring in from the multiplayer version of the game, or what new stuff does it bring into the game? And just want to do one more shout out to our new Patreon, which we've set up. Links in the description. We really want to get a community going around this podcast, and then get your feedback on what to cover next. I'm really, really excited to see how that goes. And obviously it'll help support us keep going and make this podcast as good as it can be.
Excellent, yes. And don't forget, you can contact us on Facebook. Links to our Facebook are in the description. You can also contact us on Instagram. We're at alwaysplayer1podcast. You can also email us. We're alwaysplayer1podcast@gmail.com. And now you can also reach out on our Discord as long as you sign up to the Patreon.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed the episode, and we'll catch you again in 2 weeks.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to support the show, don't forget to check out our Patreon page. The links to that are in the description. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode of Always Player One. Until then, reach out on Facebook, Instagram, or by email to keep the conversation going.